The Living Dead, Connecting Drug Trafficking and Poverty. Across Mexico, Central America, and South America, decisions for people are not entirely shaped by their aspirations, hopes, and dreams. Instead, it is shaped by necessity and the question of whether or not they would see another day. It is reported by the United Nations that more than 460,000 people have been murdered due to being caught in a crossfire of the government declaring war on cartels and drug-related violence since 2006. On top of this haunting statistic, we must let it be known that 3 countries, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela, account for 59% of the people in poverty in Latin America alone, in which they are living on less than $3.65 a day in 2023. As we begin to consider the connection between poverty and drug trafficking in Latin America, which we will be focusing on Mexico and El Salvador, we can imagine that behind the statistic lies countless children who grow up without access to quality education, affordable health care, or clean water. The stark difference between these 2 countries has become more prevalent as President Nayib Bukele has taken office and created radical change for El Salvador, in part to mass incarceration of MS-13 and Barrio 18 members, while Mexico has become a central hub for cartels and violence, and the United States is complicit as its main market. As I continue with this research, the more it becomes clear that there is a consistent reality. Drug trafficking thrives where poverty creates desperation. The issue itself, however, is not simply that poor communities exist. It is the fact that they exist without the backbone of a functioning and uncorrupted state to support them. In the Harvard International Review article titled Knowledge, Soil, Politics, and Poverty, it is highlighted that due to Latin America's expansive history of unequal land distribution, corruption, and lack of opportunity for youth and adults, can foster an environment where criminal organizations step in to fill the gaps of promised wealth and safety. A prime example of this cycle is none other than the early life of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Before he was known as one of the most famous drug lords, El Chapo grew up in a rural village called La Tuna that had no job opportunities in the region, according to a 7-hour-long interview with Sean Penn. He grew up in extreme poverty, and his family was forced to turn to cultivating and selling marijuana as their only source of income to keep food on the table. What is interesting, however, is that El Chapo's empire in drug trafficking is considered to have helped his region rather than tainting it, in his view, by offering a chance to either become involved in illegal work in exchange for money and stability, or stay in poverty and not see the fruits of hard labor. For him, it was obvious and inevitable, especially considering the fact that, according to a Spanish newspaper called El País, drug trafficking is in the top 5 for employment in Mexico alone, which estimates to about 175,000 people. His story represents a truth that we are scared to admit. Millions of people in Latin America are desperate for financial stability, and the truth is that the formal economy is failing to offer them opportunities, while illicit economies can ease the weight of survival in poverty. What is even more unfortunate is that the empirical research continues to reinforce the relationship between poverty and drug trafficking. A study conducted by Joshua Okundaye reveals how low-income youth in urban areas that are in poverty are more likely to be exposed to drug trafficking in various settings, whether it be in their families, schools, or neighborhoods, and are thus tempted by the opportunities drug trafficking offers. The study also emphasizes that the higher poverty rates are in a community, the more likely you are to be warped into the world of drug dealing more than an affluent area. Ultimately, the factors such as higher recruitment, parental drug use, and connections to local dealers are able to shape a child's worldview and narrow it down to drug trafficking being the only option by overwhelming them with the promise of fast money that could change the course of their lives. As we continue to think charitably and critically on this topic, we must reaffirm the idea that the conversation is not a matter of definitive personal choice or a higher inclination to be a criminal only. The entire picture takes into account structural forces that restrict the ability to have a better life in places like Mexico. For one, poverty does not automatically equate to crime. Rather, it is a combination of social fragmentation, governments that fail to show force, and organized crime that ties into more recruitment possibilities, and thus the cycle continues. A key component in this is the fact that countries like Mexico score incredibly low on the Corruption Perception Index, with a staggering score of 26 out of 100, the worst score it has received since its entry to be measured. Thanks to the protection of corrupt high-level government officials and law enforcement agencies, cartels have been able to flourish and continue to fight for power. However, Mexico's efforts are not in vain, but are also not met without violence. Increased intervention from the government to disrupt supply, transit, and leadership structures has directly caused more violence to erupt as a response from cartels, among other undesirable consequences, in which ordinary citizens are caught in the crossfire. This complexity is perfectly captured in a quote from Nick Croft, which he states, "Poor development fuels conflict, which fuels the drug trade, which fuels conflict, which fuels poverty." The continuous cycle is painful to admit, but without jobs and trust in the government, people decide to put their faith in drug trafficking and illegal networks in hopes for a better life. The cycle of poverty and organized crime in Mexico, as well as other countries in Latin America, are further deepened by constant disappearances, specifically journalists and activists. It creates the same issue the government faces of whether the safety of others or you are worth being sacrificed in order to speak up against the brutality of the cartels. The number revealed as of September of 2024, 115,000 people were documented as missing, primarily within the timeline of 2006 to 2024, when the war on drugs had escalated. Thousands are believed to be dead already and likely to be in one of the 5,700 clandestine mass graves, or remain unidentified and unclaimed in morgues and anonymous grave sites. In there lies children, mothers, fathers, activists, journalists, and so many people that were brutally murdered. To make matters worse, the National Human Identification Center had permanently shut down, therefore leaving many investigations unturned and up to families to search for their loved ones, all while facing poverty, threats, intimidations, and even as far as death, as mentioned in the DW documentary, where people like Francisco Bajaras decided to take matters into their own hands to investigate the brutal murder of his sister Lupita Bajaras, but would ultimately be tragically murdered as well. Families like the Bajaras are now deemed the living dead, facing the harsh reality of cartels dictating their lives so blatantly with violence. The silence of the governments, families, and journalists allows violence to carry on unchecked. Strategies to dismantle the drug trafficking world can be seen in countries like El Salvador under the leadership of President Nayib Bukele by using the mass incarceration strategy and his plan called Zero Leisure that has been under constant scrutiny. Under his presidency, thousands of alleged members of the cartels and gangs have been arrested and placed in CICOT, which is a terrorism confinement center where criminals with the worst charges or direct connection to MS-13 and Barrio 18 are held. A prisoner named Marvin Vasquez, who was a MS-13 gang member, admits in a CNN interview that almost everyone in CICOT is there for a reason, going as far as having to murder to survive in the drug world. And yet, despite the harsh environment he will spend his life in, he goes on to say, "We did bad things and we have to pay the rough way, doing time." In the same video, the reporter later meets with a man named Juan Carlos, who was wrongfully held in a low-security prison for 5 months due to his tattoos, but was then later released. The Bukele administration admits that some people who are innocent have been lumped into the purge to weed out criminals. However, more than 7,000 have been released, proving that more investigations are being made and justice for those who are innocent can be served. Juan Carlos believes that Bukele's strategy is justified in order to deliver a safer El Salvador for all civilians, especially those in poverty. The crackdown on gang violence and drug trafficking has transformed places like San Salvador from the murder capital of the world to one of the safest places to live in Latin America, a vision that is desired for places like Mexico. Critics claim that these methods are extreme and a violation of human rights, as well as considering the possibility that many young men from poor backgrounds had no other choice. They also argue that focusing solely on punishment rather than alleviating the issues of poverty as a root cause can push more youth into the same cycle as seen in Mexico. However, as seen in the independent journalist video on prison systems in El Salvador, prisons other than CCOT focus on educating and rehabilitating prisoners in order to be reintroduced to society and take time off their sentence through work has provided to be effective. Prisons like La Esperanza and La Granja have been the forefront of revitalizing El Salvador by allowing prisoners with common crimes to work and contribute to the economy, as well as even obtain a college degree in fields like business administration and learn useful skills ranging from sewing, mechanics, carpentry, medicine, cooking, construction, plumbing, and even farming, all of which are used to self-sustain all prisons and aid the economy. The revolutionary style of these prisons has been incredibly effective in changing the lives of the prisoners for the better, which many expressed their gratitude for the president in the video for giving them the opportunities in light of their crimes and preventing a higher risk of recidivism by providing the skills to gain formal employment. Ultimately, seeing how El Salvador was able to change their country for the better despite its deep roots in gang and cartel violence, there is hope that countries like Mexico view El Salvador as a model to follow if it wishes to eradicate drug trafficking and alleviate the issues of poverty. Understanding the issue of poverty in the lens of drug trafficking in Mexico and El Salvador as Americans is significant because our consumption and export of weapons has directly fueled the tensions across our border. And if we truly want to concern ourselves with the issue of poverty, whether it be domestic or foreign, we must acknowledge the poverty driving the drug trade itself, and it's what causes the rise in suffering for millions, political tension, and humanitarian crises. While majority of the responsibility lies on Mexico to invest in an El Salvador-like mission, as well as infrastructure, sanitation, schools, jobs, and rebuilding of local governance, it is important that as a collective we actively learn about issues that infringe on the respect of the dignity of every person if we wish to help restore it. Until we address the structural forces that push people to turn towards illicit economies, families will continue to suffer at the hands of drug trafficking, violence will run rampant, and generations will forever be changed when they deserve economies of stability, safety, and dignity just as much as anyone else. Thank you.